My sister turned my most vulnerable and painful medical moment into a $500,000 paycheck by selling a secretly recorded video to a dark media outlet that thrives on exploitation. I am Jolene, a 30-year-old asset valuation specialist from Portland, who spent years building a life of integrity only to have my own flesh and blood auction off my dignity, while the rest of my family sat around the dinner table laughing at the footage. They looked me in the eye and claimed that being turned into a viral mockery was just a harmless joke for entertainment, insisting I was being overly sensitive for feeling violated when I was actually at my weakest. I didn't waste my breath arguing with people who saw me as a content piece rather than a human being, so I simply gathered my newborn son and walked out into the cold Oregon rain without a single backward glance. They didn't realize that my silence wasn't a surrender, because one single phone call to the right person was about to freeze her bank accounts and turn their laughter into screams of terror as the legal system closed in on them. Before I reveal how I dismantled her life and reclaimed every cent of that blood money, please let me know what time it is and which city you are watching from, so I can see how far my story has traveled. If you believe that family loyalty should never be a license for betrayal, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments to help me reach more people who need to hear this. The foundation of this betrayal was not built overnight, because the roots of favoritism in our household ran deeper than the Douglas firs surrounding our childhood home in the outskirts of Portland. My mother, Rosemary, never tried to hide her adoration for Regina, treating her like a porcelain doll that could do no wrong, even when she was shattering the peace of our home with her constant demands for attention and resources. While I was expected to be the reliable and quiet daughter who achieved high grades and stayed out of trouble, Regina was encouraged to pursue every whim, regardless of the cost to our family's modest savings. I remember sitting at the kitchen table as a teenager watching my father Harold sign away my college fund because Regina convinced him that she needed a luxury car to start her career in high-end real estate. Harold was a man who preferred silence over conflict, and he would often nod along to Rosemary's claims that Regina was destined for greatness, while I was simply built to endure. This dynamic created a toxic environment where my boundaries were treated as mere suggestions that my sister could overlook whenever it suited her needs. By the time I reached my late 20s and established myself as a successful asset valuation specialist, I had learned to build walls of steel around my personal life to protect my sanity from their chaos. My husband Grant was the only person who truly understood the weight of this baggage, and he often encouraged me to distance myself from the constant cycle of Regina's manufactured crises. Grant worked as a senior software engineer and possessed a logical mind that saw through Regina's theatrical apologies, yet he supported my desire to maintain a civil relationship for the sake of family holidays. Regina had spent her entire adult life jumping from one failed business venture to another, eventually opening a luxury boutique that drained every cent of the inheritance Rosemary had set aside for our future. Whenever I tried to point out the unfairness of this financial drain, my mother would wave her hand dismissively and tell me that sisters should support each other without keeping score. Rosemary had a peculiar way of twisting my success into a reason why I should be the one to sacrifice, suggesting that, because I had a stable career and a loving husband, I owed it to Regina to help her stay afloat. This sense of entitlement peaked when Regina's business began to crumble under the weight of unpaid debts and predatory loans she had taken out without telling anyone. She began showing up at our house, unannounced, her eyes red from crying as she begged for small loans that she promised to repay within weeks, only to disappear until she needed more. I saw the desperation in her eyes, but I also saw the calculating coldness behind them, a trait that our parents had nurtured by never holding her accountable for her actions. Despite my misgivings, I occasionally helped her with small amounts of money because I still harbored a faint hope that she might one day value me for more than my bank account. The tension escalated when I announced my pregnancy, a moment that should have been joyful but was immediately overshadowed by Regina's complaints that a baby would make it harder for me to focus on helping her. Rosemary actually had the audacity to suggest that Grant and I should downsize our home so we could use the extra equity to pay off Regina's creditors before the baby arrived. I refused, of course, and that was the first time Harold looked at me with genuine disappointment, as if my desire to provide a stable future for my child was an act of selfishness against the family unit. Regina didn't take the rejection well and spent weeks posting cryptic messages on social media about how money changes people and how some relatives forget their roots once they achieve a bit of status. I ignored the bait, focusing instead on preparing for the arrival of my son and trying to find a doctor who would respect the strict privacy boundaries I had set for the delivery room. My profession taught me the value of confidentiality and the danger of exposed assets, and I wanted my transition into motherhood to be a private ceremony between Grant and me. I didn't want cameras, I didn't want live updates, and I certainly didn't want the spectacle that Regina seemed to crave in every aspect of her own life. Little did I know that my mother was already whispering in Regina's ear, telling her that the arrival of the first grandchild was the perfect opportunity to bring the whole family back together under one roof. Rosemary believed that if she could just get us all in the same room, the resentment would melt away, and I would return to being the submissive daughter who fixed everyone's problems. Regina saw it differently, though, as she viewed my pregnancy not as a miracle, but as a high-value event that could be monetized to solve her mounting financial disasters. She began researching the growing market for private medical footage, realizing that there were audiences willing to pay exorbitant amounts for unedited and raw content from the delivery room. The logic was simple and cruel. If I wouldn't give her the money directly, she would take it from my body and my dignity without ever asking for my permission. She spent those early months studying the layout of the hospital we had chosen, pretending to be a supportive sister, while secretly planning the heist of my most private moments. Every time she hugged me or felt the baby kick, she wasn't connecting with her nephew. She was scouting the best angles for the lenses she planned to hide in plain sight. This was the silent war being waged behind the smiles and the baby shower gifts, a betrayal so profound that it would eventually shatter the very foundation of the family Rosemary worked so hard to preserve. 6 months before my son was born, Regina arrived at my doorstep with a basket of organic teas and an apology that seemed so genuine it actually managed to pierce the armor I had spent decades building. She sat on my velvet sofa and spoke softly about how her business failure had humbled her, claiming that she finally understood why I had been so protective of my boundaries and my hard-earned stability. Rosemary had accompanied her, sitting on the edge of her seat and nodding vigorously while adding that Regina had been attending counseling to deal with her impulsive behavior and her need for constant validation. I wanted to believe them because the physical exhaustion of the second trimester was starting to take its toll, and the idea of a peaceful family environment was more seductive than I cared to admit. Grant remained skeptical, standing in the kitchen with his arms crossed as he watched Regina display a level of contrition that felt almost too rehearsed for someone who had been so vitriolic just weeks prior. He whispered to me later that night that people don't change their entire personality because of a few weeks of silence, but I argued that maybe the pressure of the debts had finally forced her to grow up. My mother started visiting more frequently, always bringing nursery decorations and talking about how she wanted to be the kind of grandmother who was present for every milestone. She would often mention how Regina was so eager to make amends that she had been researching the best postpartum care techniques to help me once the baby arrived. It felt like a coordinated effort to lower my guard, a slow and deliberate erosion of the walls I had built to keep their drama at bay. During one of these visits, Regina asked if she could be my birth partner alongside Grant, claiming that she wanted to witness the miracle of life to help ground her own sense of purpose. I hesitated, remembering my strict rule about privacy, but Rosemary chimed in to say that having a female relative present was a traditional source of strength that I shouldn't ignore. They both promised that my rules would be respected, and that no cameras or phones would be allowed in the delivery suite at any time for any reason. Regina even laughed about it, saying she was too squeamish to even look at a needle, let alone record anything as intense as a live birth. I eventually agreed to let her wait in the transition room, thinking that her presence might actually bridge the gap that had existed between us since childhood. We spent the following weeks touring the maternity ward at the center in Portland, where the staff assured us that patient privacy was their highest priority and that security was tight. Regina took a keen interest in the room's layout, asking questions about the lighting and the position of the medical equipment under the guise of wanting to know where to stand to be most helpful. I thought she was being thorough, but in reality she was mapping out the blind spots where the hospital's own security cameras couldn't see what she was doing. She began gifting me small items for the hospital bag, including a high-end designer robe with large decorative buttons and a specialized insulated coffee mug that she insisted I use for hydration. I didn't realize that these were not gifts of love, but sophisticated housing units for the miniature lenses she had purchased with the last of her credit limit. Every time we discussed the birth plan, she would gently nudge me toward the most dramatic aspects of the procedure, asking about my pain tolerance and whether I would opt for a natural birth or an epidural. She was essentially scripting the video in her head, knowing that the more raw and agonizing the footage, the higher the price it would command from the specialized buyers she had contacted. My father, Harold, stayed in the background as usual, but he would occasionally call to tell me how proud he was of Regina for turning her life around and supporting me. It felt like the entire family was finally moving toward a healthy place, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I truly belonged to a supportive unit. Grant tried to stay out of the way, but he made sure to double-check the hospital's guest policy, ensuring that only Regina and Rosemary would have access to the private wing. We spent our evenings discussing names and dreaming about the future, blissfully unaware that the person I was trusting to hold my hand was actually calculating the market value of my pain. Regina had even gone as far as to create a fake portfolio for a documentary project she claimed to be working on for a local college, using it as a cover to purchase professional-grade hidden recording equipment. She practiced using the devices in her own home, learning how to steady her hand and adjust the angles without drawing attention to her movements. The level of premeditation was chilling, as she had spent months practicing the expressions of concern and the words of encouragement she would use while the cameras were rolling. She knew that my vulnerability would be her greatest asset, and she was prepared to exploit every scream and every tear for the sake of her own financial resurrection. Rosemary continued to play her part, constantly reminding me how lucky I was to have a sister who was willing to put her own life on hold to be there for me. I felt a sense of guilt for my past coldness, and I began to open up to Regina about my fears and my hopes for my son's future. I shared stories of my own childhood insecurities, not realizing that I was providing the emotional narration that she would later use to add depth to the video she was selling. The trap was set with such precision that by the time the first contractions began in the middle of a rainy October night, I didn't just welcome Regina into the room, I actually reached for her hand as a source of comfort. 3 months before the world saw the worst moments of my life, I had performed an act of immense generosity that I thought would finally secure Regina's loyalty forever. She had been facing a devastating lawsuit from a former business partner over a breached contract, and the legal fees were threatening to land her in a state-appointed bankruptcy court. I sat down with Grant and convinced him that we should use a portion of our house savings to pay off her immediate debts, believing that this would be the final bridge to her reformation. I remember the way her hands trembled when I handed her that check for nearly $50,000 in our kitchen, and the way she sobbed into my shoulder, promising that she would never forget what I had done for her. She called me her savior and her best friend, while Rosemary stood by crying tears of joy, claiming that this was the moment our family had finally become whole again. However, that money didn't buy her gratitude. It only fueled her resentment because it served as a constant reminder that I was successful, while she was a failure who had to be rescued by her younger sister. Behind my back, Regina was already deep in negotiations with an offshore media entity that specialized in high-stakes reality content, which was really just a euphemism for the exploitation of private medical trauma. They had offered her a staggering sum of $500,000 if she could provide a comprehensive multi-angle documentary of a high-status professional undergoing a complicated and emotional birth. Regina had pitched me as the perfect subject, describing me as a cold and calculated specialist whose breaking point would be worth a fortune to their subscribers. She used the money I gave her not to pay off all her debts, but to purchase the most advanced covert recording technology available on the gray market, including buttonhole cameras and sensors disguised as medical jewelry. On the day I went into labor, the atmosphere in the Portland Birthing Center was quiet and professional, exactly as I had requested. Regina arrived shortly after we checked in, wearing the designer blouse with the camera buttons and carrying the insulated mug she had insisted I keep nearby. She was incredibly attentive, mopping my brow with cool cloths and whispering words of encouragement that I now realize were timed perfectly for the audio recording. When my labor took a turn for the worse and the pain became an all-consuming fire that stripped away my ability to maintain my composure, Regina leaned in closer. She wasn't checking my vitals. She was ensuring the lens in her blouse had a clear shot of my face as I screamed in agony. Grant was overwhelmed by the intensity of the situation, and, when the nurse suggested he take a 5-minute break to get some air before the final push, Regina was quick to step into his place. "I've got her, Grant. Go get some water. I won't leave her side for a second," she said, with a supportive smile that masked her predatory intent. During those minutes when it was just me and her, the labor reached its peak of raw, unshielded trauma, and I was forced into positions that left me completely exposed and devoid of any dignity. I was crying out that I couldn't do it anymore, pleading with the doctors to just make the pain stop, and Regina was right there, adjusting my gown under the guise of comfort while actually improving the camera's view. She captured the most graphic details of the delivery, the medical complications that arose, and the moments of pure, unadulterated fear that I never intended for anyone to see but my husband and my medical team. Even when my son was finally born and the room filled with the sound of his first cries, Regina wasn't just crying from joy. She was checking the recording status on her hidden devices. She watched as the doctors discussed the physical damage my body had sustained, recording the intimate details of my recovery process and the immediate postpartum struggles I faced in those first few hours. The level of betrayal was so meticulously orchestrated that she even managed to trick me into signing a stack of hospital discharge forms that were actually disguised consent waivers and media release documents. I was drifting in a haze of painkillers and exhaustion, my mind unable to process the legal jargon she was placing in front of me, as she whispered that it was just routine paperwork for the insurance company. I signed them blindly, trusting the sister who had just saved me during the most difficult hours of my life. My father, Harold, arrived later that evening with flowers praising Regina for her strength and her dedication to the family, while my mother beamed with pride at the daughter she had always favored. They stayed for hours acting like a loving family while the digital files of my humiliation were already being uploaded to a secure server in another country. Regina left the hospital that night with a $500,000 deal finalized, leaving me to heal from a trauma I didn't even know had been turned into a commodity. She spent the next few days editing the footage, adding dramatic subtitles and context that painted me in the most unflattering light possible to ensure the video would go viral among the niche audience it was intended for. I was still in the hospital, struggling with the physical and emotional toll of the birth, while my own sister was calculating exactly how much she could spend on her new life once the final payment cleared. The silence of the hospital room felt like a sanctuary, but it was really just the quiet before the storm that would destroy my reputation and my faith in humanity. Every time I looked at my son, I felt a sense of peace, that I had survived the ordeal, never imagining that the person I had trusted most was at that very moment selling my soul for the price of a luxury estate. The rainy Portland evening was supposed to be a celebration of life as our family gathered at my parents' house for my son's 1-month milestone, but the air felt heavy with a tension I couldn't quite name. We were sitting in the dining room, the same room where I had been told to be quiet and nuang nin my whole life, when my mother Rosemary decided to show us something on her new iPad. She was laughing, her face lit by the blue glow of the screen as she turned it toward me and said I had finally become famous in the way Regina always wanted to be. My heart stopped when I saw the thumbnail of a video titled "The Ice Queen Melts," featuring a frozen frame of my face contorted in a scream of absolute agony from the delivery room. I snatched the device from her hand, my fingers trembling so violently I nearly dropped it, as I realized I was looking at a high-definition recording of my most private and agonizing moments. The video had over 1 million views on a specialized real-life trauma platform, and the comments were a cesspool of strangers mocking my appearance, my screams, and the graphic details of my body's failure during labor. I looked up at Regina, who was casually sipping wine at the other end of the table, her expression one of mild boredom rather than the shame I expected to see. "What is this? Regina, you swore there were no cameras, you promised me privacy." I whispered, my voice cracking under the weight of the betrayal. Regina just shrugged and leaned back in her chair, a cold smile playing on her lips as she replied that I should be grateful for the exposure because it was educational content that showed the reality of childbirth. My mother chimed in with a sharp laugh, telling me to stop being so dramatic and that it was just a bit of fun that had finally put our family on the map. Even my father Harold didn't look away from his plate, muttering that if the video was already out there, there was no point in making a scene and ruining the evening for everyone else. They sat there and laughed at the moments where I was pleading for my life, calling my pain theatrical, and telling me that I was being an ungrateful sister for not supporting Regina's new career as a content creator. I watched as Regina pulled up the analytics on her phone, bragging about the $500,000 she had already secured from the licensing deal and the bonus she expected for the viral engagement. "Think of it as a return on investment, Jolene." Regina said, her voice dripping with a malice she no longer bothered to hide. "You always were the one with the assets. I just figured out how to liquidate them." The room felt like it was spinning as I realized that my own parents had not only known about the recording, but had actually helped Regina pick the best clips to include in the final edit. They saw my humiliation as a win for the family bank account, a way to settle Regina's debts and secure their own comfort without having to rely on my charity anymore. Grant stood up, his face a mask of cold fury as he took the iPad and deleted the app, but we both knew the damage was already done and the video was being mirrored across dozens of websites. I looked at the people I had called my family, seeing them for the first time as the predators they truly were, individuals who valued a paycheck more than my basic human dignity. "It was just for fun, Jolene. What's the big deal? You're fine now, aren't you?" Rosemary said, her tone dismissive and cruel as she reached for the wine bottle. I didn't scream and I didn't cry because a strange and icy calm settled over me, the kind of clarity that only comes when you realize you have absolutely nothing left to lose with these people. I stood up from the table, walked into the nursery where my son was sleeping, and began packing his bag with steady, methodical movements. Grant followed me, his hand on my shoulder, a silent promise of support, as we ignored the taunts and the laughter following us from the dining room. Regina shouted after me that I was a boring killjoy, who never knew how to take a joke, while my mother yelled that I was being disrespectful for leaving before dessert was served. I didn't respond to their insults, and I didn't look back at the house that had been my prison for 30 years, because I finally understood that these people didn't deserve my anger. They deserved my absence. As we walked out into the rain, the sound of their laughter fading behind the heavy oak door, I felt the weight of my past life falling away like dead skin. I held my son tightly against my chest, feeling his heartbeat against mine, and realized that I was the only person in the world who truly cared about his right to a life of privacy and respect. Grant started the car, and for several minutes we just sat in the darkness of the driveway, the windshield wipers struggling against the Portland downpour. "What do we do now?" Grant asked, his voice low and steady, ready for whatever command I was about to give. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the name I had been saving for an emergency just like this, a person who knew how to dismantle financial empires with a few strokes of a keyboard. I looked at the house one last time, seeing the warm glow of the windows where my family was currently celebrating their windfall from my suffering. "I'm not going to argue with them anymore," I said, my voice as cold and sharp as a scalpel. "I'm just going to finish this." I hit the call button, and as the line began to ring, I felt a sense of power I had never known before, the power of a woman who had been pushed too far. The joke was over, but the punchline was going to be something that none of them would ever forget as long as they lived. The morning after the dinner, the silence in our new apartment was broken only by the hum of Grant's multiple computer monitors as he began the technical side of our retaliation. I sat at the kitchen island nursing a coffee I couldn't taste while I waited for Desmond, my oldest friend and a top-tier attorney specializing in digital assets and privacy law, to answer his private line. When he finally picked up, his voice was thick with sleep, but he sharpened instantly the moment I described the nature of the footage and the amount of money Regina had boasted about. 500,000, Jolene. That's not a small-time influencer deal. That's a corporate acquisition of private data. Desmond said, his tone shifting into the professional coldness that had made him famous in the legal circles of the Pacific Northwest. He explained that because the recording happened in a private medical facility in Oregon and involved the non-consensual distribution of sensitive bodily images, we weren't just looking at a civil suit, but a potential felony case for invasion of privacy. I felt a grim sense of satisfaction as he outlined the steps we would take to freeze the blood money before Regina could spend another cent on her luxury lifestyle. We spent the next 4 hours documenting every link, every mirror of the video, and every piece of metadata that Regina had been foolish enough to leave in the digital trail of her transaction. Grant used his expertise as a software engineer to trace the IP addresses of the uploads, discovering that the video had been sold to a conglomerate known for bypassing standard ethical guidelines for viral content. This was the break we needed because it proved that the distribution was commercial and premeditated, which stripped away any defense Regina might have had about educational purposes or family fun. By noon, Desmond had filed an emergency injunction in the Multnomah County Court, a legal kill switch that ordered the immediate removal of the content and the freezing of all accounts associated with Regina's business and personal name. I watched from the monitor as the first wave of takedown notices hit the servers, seeing the video unavailable message replace the images of my suffering one by one. It was like watching a digital forest fire being extinguished, but the real work was just beginning because we had to prove the fraud Regina committed to get my signature on those release forms. Desmond contacted the birthing center's administration, informing them that a felony had been committed on their premises and that they would be held liable if they didn't provide the unedited security footage of the transition room. The hospital, terrified of a massive medical privacy lawsuit, cooperated immediately, sending over high-resolution files that clearly showed Regina tampering with medical equipment and slipping a clipboard under my hand while I was clearly incoherent from pain. Looking at those clips made my stomach churn, but they were the smoking gun we needed to prove that the consent was obtained through duress and deception. I also had the forensic results from the teacup Regina had insisted I use, which showed traces of a powerful synthetic labor inducer that she had likely obtained through her connections in the unregulated beauty and wellness industry. This was no longer just a family drama about a mean sister. This was a criminal assault involving the chemical alteration of my body for financial gain. Regina had essentially poisoned me to ensure that my labor would be as dramatic and profitable as possible for her documentary. Desmond called me back late that afternoon, his voice carrying a note of triumph as he confirmed that the Oregon State Police had opened a criminal investigation into the drugging and the illegal recording. They're going after her for multiple counts of felony assault and fraud, Jolene. This isn't something her parents can laugh away with a joke about being sensitive, he said. I felt a weight lifting off my chest, but it was replaced by a cold, hard determination to see this through to the very end without a single moment of hesitation. I received dozens of frantic text messages from my mother, Rosemary, who had clearly noticed that Regina's credit cards were suddenly being declined at the luxury car dealership. She was accusing me of being cruel and vindictive, claiming that I was trying to ruin Regina's life over a simple mistake that should have stayed within the family. I didn't reply to any of them, blocking her number and Harold's number as well, because their words no longer had any power to hurt me or influence my decisions. I knew that Regina was currently in her luxury apartment surrounded by the designer clothes she had bought with my trauma, unaware that the police were already drafting the warrant for her arrest. Every cent she had earned from my body was being reclaimed by the court to be held in an escrow account until the final judgment, leaving her with nothing but the debts she had tried so hard to escape. Grant and I sat on our balcony that night looking out at the Portland skyline, and for the first time in weeks, the air felt clean, and the future felt like something we could actually control. We had reclaimed my story from the predators who tried to sell it, and we had done it with the very tools of logic and law that Regina had always mocked me for using. I realized then that my silence at the dinner table wasn't a sign of weakness. It was the quiet before the execution of a perfect plan that would restore my dignity. The joke was finally turning back on the person who started it, and the punchline was going to be the sound of a prison cell door locking behind her for a very long time. 2 days after I initiated the legal proceedings, the reality of the situation finally shattered the delusional bubble my family had lived in for decades. I was sitting in the quiet of my living room when my front door nearly buckled under the weight of my mother's frantic pounding, her screams echoing through the hallway of our apartment building. Rosemary and Harold had driven through a thunderstorm from the outskirts of the city, their faces pale and distorted by a kind of fear I had never seen in them before. When I finally opened the door, my mother didn't offer an apology or a hug. She immediately began wailing about how the police had swarmed Regina's apartment and dragged her out in handcuffs in front of all her neighbors. "How could you do this to your own sister, Jolene? She's in a cold cell right now because of your selfishness." Rosemary shrieked, her hands trembling as she tried to shove her way past me. I stood my ground, my posture as rigid as the laws I was using to dismantle them, and informed her that Regina was in a cell because she was a criminal who had assaulted and exploited her own flesh and blood. Harold stood behind her, his usual mask of quiet indifference replaced by a desperate, hallowed look, as he begged me to think about the family's reputation in Portland. He claimed that if the story of the drugging and the video went public, he would lose his standing at the country club, and their social circle would shun them forever. They were still more worried about their status than the fact that their daughter had poisoned me and sold my most private moments to the highest bidder on the internet. She was just trying to fix her life. Jolene. She needed that money to pay off the people who were threatening her. My father shouted, his voice cracking as he realized his usual authority over me was gone. I looked at him and felt a profound sense of pity, realizing that he had been an accomplice to Regina's narcissism for so long that he no longer knew the difference between a mistake and a felony. I showed them the forensic report of the synthetic oxytocin found in my tea and the security footage of Regina tricking me into signing the release forms while I was screaming in pain. My mother didn't even blink at the evidence, dismissively waving it away and saying that Regina was always creative with her solutions and that I should have been more supportive of her vision. It was the ultimate confirmation that I was never a person to them. I was just a resource to be harvested whenever Regina's own poor choices caught up with her. If you don't drop the charges and release the freeze on her accounts, we will lose the house, Jolene. We signed as guarantors for her new business using our home as collateral. Rosemary cried, her voice shifting from anger to a pathetic, manipulative whimpering. This was the real reason they were there. They hadn't come to save Regina out of love, but out of a desperate need to save their own financial necks from the fire she had started. They had gambled their entire future on Regina's viral documentary, believing that my humiliation would be the golden ticket that paid off their debts and secured their retirement. I realized then that the laughter at the dinner table wasn't just cruel. It was celebratory, as they were literally toasted to the money my trauma was bringing into their bank accounts. I told them very calmly that the house was already gone the moment they trusted a predator like Regina, and that I would not be withdrawing a single charge or releasing a single cent of the frozen funds. My mother fell to her knees, grabbing at my hem and begging me to be the good daughter one last time, promising that they would make Regina apologize properly once this was all over. I stepped back, looking down at the woman who had spent 30 years eroding my self-worth to build up a monster, and felt absolutely nothing but a cold, clean sense of finality. The daughter you're looking for died in that delivery room while you were busy counting the views on her agony. I said, my voice steady and devoid of any emotion that they could use against me. Harold tried to argue that I was being unchristian and that forgiveness was a requirement of family, but I pointed out that justice was a requirement of the law, and I was choosing law over their toxic brand of loyalty. I informed them that if they didn't leave my property immediately, I would call the same officers who had arrested Regina to have them removed for trespassing. The look of pure, unadulterated hatred that crossed my mother's face in that moment was the most honest emotion she had ever shown me, and it was the final confirmation that I was doing the right thing. They retreated down the hallway, their voices still echoing with curses and threats of disinheritance, but those threats were hollow because they had nothing left to take from me. I closed the door and locked it, leaning my head against the wood as I listened to the elevator doors close on the life I used to have. Grant came out of the kitchen and wrapped his arms around me, his presence a stark contrast to the hollow, parasitic love I had just evicted from my home. We knew the coming months would be exhausting, filled with depositions and court dates, but the heaviest part of the burden had been lifted the moment I realized I didn't owe them my life. The predators were finally being forced to face the consequences of their hunger, and for the first time in my 30 years, I was no longer on the menu. 12 months after the legal firestorm began, the dust has finally settled on the ruins of my former family, leaving a landscape that is both lonely and incredibly liberating. Regina was convicted on multiple counts of felony assault and the illegal distribution of non-consensual private imagery, a landmark case in Oregon that set a new precedent for digital privacy rights. The evidence of the drugging was so overwhelming that the judge denied her any possibility of a plea deal, sentencing her to a decade in a state penitentiary without the chance for early parole. She sat in the courtroom during the sentencing, her designer clothes replaced by a drab orange jumpsuit looking smaller and more pathetic than I ever thought possible. She didn't look like a high-end real estate mogul or a viral influencer. She looked like a common thief who had finally run out of people to rob. My parents, Rosemary and Harold, suffered the exact fate they had feared, losing their home and their social standing as the details of their complicity became public knowledge through the trial transcripts. They moved into a cramped apartment in a part of the city they used to mock, abandoned by the friends who had only valued them for the status they could no longer maintain. They still try to send me letters occasionally filled with the same toxic mix of guilt-tripping and demands for financial support, but I send them back unopened, marked as "Return to Sender." I have completely severed every tie, changing my last name back to my husband's and moving our lives to a coastal town where nobody knows me as the viral birth mother. Grant has been my rock through the entire process, helping me navigate the PTSD of the medical assault and ensuring that our son, who is now a thriving toddler, grows up in an environment defined by respect and true boundaries. We used the $500,000 of reclaimed blood money to establish a legal defense fund for other victims of digital exploitation, turning the currency of my pain into a shield for others. My son will never know the people who tried to sell his birth for a paycheck, and he will never have to wonder if his mother's love was conditional on his marketability. I still have days where the memory of that delivery room makes my heart race, but those moments are becoming fewer and further between as I build new healthy memories in our quiet home by the sea. I've returned to my work as an asset valuation specialist, but I now volunteer my time to help nonprofits audit the unethical practices of media conglomerates that profit from human suffering. The justice system didn't just punish Regina. It restored my sense of agency, proving that the law can be a powerful tool for the voiceless when it's wielded with precision and courage. I realized that the joke my family laughed at was actually a mirror reflecting their own hollow souls, and by shattering that mirror, I finally set myself free. Looking back, I am not the victim of a viral video. I am the architect of a new life that is founded on the principles of dignity, privacy, and the fierce protection of those I love. The silence of my current life is not a void, but a beautiful resonant space where I can finally hear my own voice without the interference of their constant demands. I have learned that family is not a matter of blood, but a matter of behavior, and that loyalty must be earned through respect rather than demanded through manipulation. If you are listening to my story and you find yourself trapped in a cycle of family betrayal or feeling like your boundaries are being ignored, please know that you have the right to walk away. You are not a content piece, you are not a resource for someone else's greed, and you are not obligated to forgive people who are not sorry for hurting you. Thank you for staying with me until the very end of this long and difficult journey. It was not easy to share these details, but I hope that my experience gives you the courage to stand up for your own dignity, even when the people pushing you down are the ones who are supposed to love you the most. If this story resonated with you, please share it with someone who might be going through a similar struggle to let them know they are not alone. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel to support more stories about justice, resilience, and the power of setting boundaries. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever had to cut a toxic family member out of your life to save yourself? How did you find the strength to do it? Let's start a conversation below and support each other in reclaiming our narratives from those who try to steal them. Your voice